our thoughts on remote work and why we believe that it's so important for companies to get back to a work schedule that is at least close to what we used to have in terms of people gathering together and working. Now, this could potentially be solved in hybrid ways, such as things like offsites and those sort of things. But overall, we believe that the way people work is one of the fundamental problems of the current economic environment and the source of inflation, and therefore actually a much easier solution than what the Fed is doing, which is basically slamming the economy and killing demand. So we want to talk about this in two contexts. One is just recently came across an interview with Marc Andreessen, where I have to say I am a little bit disappointed at his comments, simply because his context is that he thinks remote work is a good thing, and he believes that the trend was started by the lockdowns in COVID, and that therefore this is something that, let's say, his firm wants to embrace and the company of the future should embrace, which is diagonally controversial with somebody else named Elon Musk, who just this week basically made it clear to his employees at Twitter that he wants them to get back to the office. So I want to discuss this, call it friction between these two, call it leaders in Silicon Valley. And I have to say, my conclusion is that Andreessen's wrong, and Andreessen's wrong for several reasons. And one of the main problems that I see is actually his own firm deteriorating, making mistakes one after the other, some bigger, some smaller, but inconsistencies, mistakes that you wouldn't expect a leader like that to make. So again, this episode is a little bit special in the sense that it's a reaction episode to an interview that Marc Andreessen gave, but also a general outlook on the economy, and we believe, like I said, a lot less painful solution to a problem that is, I think, occupying everybody, which is the inflation and the extreme stance of the Fed to stop this inflation. This is not even on podcast. It's November 11, 2022. This is Crindelco. For the day, the fund is up 1.9%. The market is up about 90 basis points for the year. We are down 52.4%. The market is down 13.8%. We're underperforming by 38.6%. The main underperformance is driven by Tesla, and the reason for that is, one, is the largest position, and the stock is being hit because Elon Musk is selling. Why is Elon Musk selling? Because he has a problem with Twitter. The Twitter situation is such that this is now our conjecture, is that I think he's going to close down basically almost all the existing revenue streams and try to rebuild the company from scratch. I don't know if that's an explicit goal or a goal that he's being coerced into, but the way we see it is that he wants to get away from advertising because it's a bad business model, and also because the cost of that is relatively low right now because the advertisers are leaving anyway. And he wants to impose a model on Twitter that is purpose-driven and revenue-driven by subscription, revenue-driven by value, all those sort of things. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on Twitter because I really don't have a good solution. But we believe that the main problem with Twitter is the lack of purpose, and therefore it's going to be very difficult to find, let's say, a value function, if you will. So let's say if we take TikTok is for entertainment, YouTube is for education, Twitter can be for opinion, for example. Twitter can be for exchanging information in certain silos, such as research, science, things like that. But again, it's going to be very difficult to unculture the people from the current culture of Twitter and get them used to something new. If I think back in the history of particularly the internet, this hasn't been done before. Yahoo wasn't able to pivot to some sort of search algorithm that Google was doing. Microsoft wasn't able to even develop a search algorithm that competes with Google. Nobody was able to compete with Facebook, so on and so forth. So it's relatively difficult. What Musk is trying to do is, let's call it very, I wouldn't say impossible, but it just lacks, there's no analogy. Now he's, of course, the world champion in condemning analogy and say, look, you can't reason by analogy, so we don't want to do that. And we don't want to condemn the situation from the get-go. So let's focus on what actually can be done. And one of the things that Musk is doing is he wants people to come back to work. And I want to talk about this specifically and contrast 2 points of view. One is Marc Andreessen in a recent interview where he basically says that remote work is the future. His own firm has chosen to be remote, and that is a good thing, and that is the future of work and the future of knowledge work and so on and so forth. On the other side is Elon Musk, who I would say also runs a knowledge work organization, particularly Twitter, but pretty much all these companies are knowledge work companies. In other words, intellectual property, creativity, solutions, problems solving, iteration, Popperian type approaches to problems. That's the core of what Musk is doing. So why is Musk asking his people to come back? In a nutshell, I think it's because what I just said. I think Musk sees a company as a set of Popperian problem solution actions. So it's kind of like a reinforcement learning problem where you have a bunch of people and you don't need a lot, but you need a sort of an optimal number of people, which is sort of the 0 to 1 concept of Peter Thiel. So what's the optimal size of a startup? What's the minimum amount of people you need to solve a problem? Most of the time you can't solve a problem by yourself. There are certain problems you can solve by yourself, writing, programming. So things along that nature is, at least in the current world, better if you do it by yourself. So therefore you don't need to be around people. But any kind of problem, let's say the 4680 battery cell, finding a new strategy for Twitter, solving the spam problem, solving the trolling problem, those sort of things, impersonation of the blue check mark, all these things are relatively difficult to solve by yourself, and it requires iteration. And iteration implies errors and cost of error correction. And that's, a little bit abstract way to say that if you have a group of people that are in a room, why do we have things like war room? Let's say when the US attacks another country, there is I think it's called the control room or the situation room, something like that, where the generals and the president, they all sit in a room and discuss strategies and get information. I think I've seen movies, how that works. I've seen movies from, let's say, the Civil War, World War II. It's always like that. There's a room, people are physically present. Why are they physically present? Because they have to solve problems in real time. The cost of error is very high, and the cost of error correction is also relatively high. So you want to minimize these things, and by minimizing them, you put people in one room. Again, nobody forces people to do that, and this is the key. And this is my biggest problem I have with the other side of the argument, which is, let's say, call it the Marc Andreessen argument, that it's better to work from home and remote or whatever let's call it remote work, meaning people are dispersed in a decentralized way. The main problem I have is, Mark says it was imposed on us by the lockdowns in COVID, and then we embraced it. Now, I would say that Marc Andreessen himself actually says something, and this is the inverse of what he says. Here's what he says, and now I want to let's call it the Marc Andreessen law, or the law of Andreessen, and the inverse of law of Andreessen. So the law of Andreessen is that every idea that a lot of smart people work on voluntarily. He doesn't say the word, but I'm going to add this because that's key. So any idea where a lot of smart people work on voluntarily eventually ends up happening. Call it Andreessen, the law of Andreessen or Andreessen law. Now, I would state the inverse also, which any idea where a lot of smart people are coerced to work on by the government or by some central authority actually ends up not happening. So let's talk about the law of Andreessen. So he says, let's say the internet, social networking, things like Uber, Airbnb, I don't know, all that kind of stuff. It eventually happens. Grocery delivery, Amazon, electric cars, whatever. And I would say yes, if a lot of smart people, Web3 right now is a good example. There's no application for Web3. A lot of it is play, a lot of it is speculation, DeFi, things like that. It's easy to dismiss. What Andreessen is saying, which I believe in, it's true, if a lot of smart people choose to work on something, typically it will happen. I've been recently working on Web3, let's call it blockchain technology. And when I say working on, actually, I went out and attended a bunch of seminars at Stanford and Berkeley in particular, where I mingled with researchers, entrepreneurs, those types of people. And I have to say it's true. I mean, you have a lot of these smart people, postgrads, PhDs, entrepreneurs, those types of people working on this. Look, it's interesting, you know, decentralized decision-making, solving the Byzantine generals problem, finding, let's say, consensus mechanisms in how to solve the Byzantine generals problem, improvements on Tendermint, or maybe applying Tendermint to certain applications. Even the DeFi problems are interesting. How can you bring liquidity to a contract? How can you incentivize, you know, let's say, good behavior in a DeFi world? You can then extrapolate that to any kind of world. And how can you incentivize behavior with a contract? I spoke with Tim Roughgarden about it, the head of research at Andreessen Horowitz. You know, mechanism design. These are all interesting problems. We don't necessarily have a real application right now, but that's fine. So I think the law of Andreessen works. But here's the opposite, and this is where the remote work thing doesn't work for me. It was imposed by us by COVID. These are his words. I mean, in other words, Andreessen Horowitz was working normally like everybody else in the office. Lockdowns came. They were forced to work from home, and now they choose to continue to do that because they somehow figured, oh, this is a better way to do it. I believe that anything which is coerced by the government, by definition, doesn't work. It will eventually not work. Here's a couple of examples. We have collectivism in the Soviet Union. You could have said the same thing. Well, you know, it's a new trend. Stalin made collective farm a reality. How about we go invest in that? Because that's the future. Well, certainly it wasn't the future. We can also use an example of capitalism. The industrial military complex, Ike Eisenhower in the 1950s, imposed by the government, not very successful. You know, it took a man, Elon Musk, to build rockets to go to Mars. Our industrial military complex was not able to do it. Yes, they're good at building nuclear bombs, which, other than destroying the world, really don't have any other function. Maybe deterring other people from doing that, but let's not go there. So, in other words, anything which is coerced by the government, by definition, cannot be good. Because why didn't it happen organically? Now, before, people might shout at me and say, well, what about the internet? Well, the internet was, you know, without the government, the internet wouldn't exist. Yes, but it wasn't coerced on us. So there's a lot of things the government does. And some of the things, you know, they built the highway system. Eisenhower built the highway system. It was kind of imposed on us, but then we chose to organize ourselves around it. So in other words, I think this whole remote work situation is bad for two reasons. Number one, all employees like it and the entrepreneurs don't like it. I mean, Andreessen kind of is trying to be forward looking and stuff. From my point of view, that's not what they're doing. They're just doing whatever they have to do because they can, because they're not really in a competitive situation. The value out of Andreessen Horowitz is the name, and very often they are the market for their own startups. In other words, they decide what the value is, and they often are able to flip their startups to, let's say, Microsoft. Their track record with public companies, so stuff that they brought public, Lyft, Airbnb, and so on and so forth, not so good. Some are better than others. Airbnb is probably the only one which I would say is somewhat successful even in this environment, but everything else actually hasn't made money. So I would say there's a question mark, and I would say particularly in the last couple of years, the company has deteriorated quite a bit. They keep making mistakes. Now, I don't want to rant on them, but I just noticed that. And I think this remote work thing is just not a good idea. It's not a good idea because, again, let's get back to a little bit more scientific approach here. It's the Popperian approach to problem solving, which is the key of a company. The actual raison d'etre of a company is to apply the Popperian approach towards practical problems. That's what a company is. And for some reason, we haven't found a way yet to do this in a remote way. And it's not even clear that that is the right way. Is it really useful to have people in New Zealand and Switzerland and San Francisco working on a problem together simultaneously in a decentralized way? Why don't they just get together and solve the problem? I'm not so sure, but the key is, again, as long as it's voluntarily. Let's say that a company I follow, which I respect a lot, is Blockstream. Blockstream is a very interesting company. They're building technology on top of the Bitcoin protocol. They're all remote, and there's actually a person that I don't know him personally, but he's from Switzerland. He works there, and then he works with somebody in New Zealand. I think somebody in San Francisco. So I chose this example. They're working together and solving problems. Well, I'm not even sure that that's a good idea, but let's put that aside. At least they did this voluntarily. They did not do this because of the lockdowns. They just did it, and it happens to be the way they work. The question, of course, is could they do better? And the answer, there's no A/B testing here, so I can't say. But again, I have the most successful entrepreneur of our time, which is Elon Musk, asking his people to go back to the office. So I have these two extreme views. One, a formerly relatively successful technologist, I wouldn't say he was a very successful entrepreneur, Marc Andreessen, but a pretty successful technologist and a decent venture capitalist in terms of reputation. I'm not sure about the returns, and I'm not sure about the actual cash-on-cash money that Andreessen Horowitz is making, but the reputation is certainly good. So I have him versus, again, the most successful entrepreneur as measured by market cap, products and services, happiness of customers, all that kind of stuff. Musk, once people go work, this one doesn't, I would definitely put my money on Musk. And here's why I think this is so important, because I think the inflation problems that we have in the US and everywhere in the world are actually driven by this remote work stuff. And that's not to say that remote work forever is not going to be the solution, but right now it certainly isn't. Because what we did, we went from old style to remote, doing the same thing. That doesn't work. You're optimizing for certain things in, let's say, a traditional company. Let's say you're a company like, let's pick an example, MSCI. You're doing indices for Wall Street. You work in offices, you design indices, you sell them to fund managers, you meet, and so on and so forth. And now everything is remote. Everybody works from home with Zoom and phone calls. It just takes a lot longer to get stuff done. Mistakes happen. A lot of mistakes happen. And the mistakes cost money, and here's the thing, it's just less productive. So you make the same money, you're less productive, equals lower real productivity, and that is inflation. This is what's happening across the economy. I think we've all been there in the last couple of years where we had problems. Let's say UPS delivers a package the wrong way, or I'm waiting for my Adidas shoes, they don't come, or I just fixed a lamp. It took me 2, 3, 4 weeks to fix the lamp, and now they gave me the wrong bulb to put in the lamp. So the lamp still, even though it's fixed, I can't use it. So I have to wait for tomorrow and go back to the store and so on and so forth. Everything is more difficult. It takes longer. I mean, a building here in Los Altos, the building, it's a complex. It's a multi-family apartment complex, and they've been building this now for 4 years. When we moved in, it was supposed to be done in a month. They're still building some of the parts of the complex just simply because it's too slow. It takes too long now. That's a different problem because actually construction is certainly not a remote work type thing. But you could easily imagine that the supply chain, even for this construction side, is constrained by remote work, people making mistakes. The problem is, again, when we go back to Popper, we have problem solving, we have the cost of error and the cost of error correction. Those are the two key things. Meaning, let's say the third one is also the actual amount of errors you make. So you make more errors being home, work from home. The cost of error could be higher because by the time you fix it, you could make much more serious errors, and then the cost of error correction could be higher too. So I think those three components are the key drivers, if you will, for a Popperian approach towards problem solving, which is what a company is. We suggest that working physically in the same place for a long time, meaning for more than just a weekend on an offsite, is the much better approach. Now, to be fair to Marc Andreessen, he says, look, we're still evaluating. I think the solution could be something like a corporate hotel with offsites, maybe every 2 weeks, every month, where we meet somewhere in Scottsdale, Arizona, or someplace like that. So there could be some hybrid thing. My suggestion or my conjecture is, if that's the way they go, they will actually end up in a similar place like we already were, which is some sort of campus type situation. Here, again, I live in Los Altos, so I'm very close to the Apple campus, the Google campus, and the Facebook campus, and they're all kind of similar. They feel like a campus, like Stanford. There's not a lot of difference between Stanford and Facebook and Apple, and just physically when you walk out, of course, there's a huge difference what's going on there, but from outside it feels very similar. There's things, offices, rooms, people, workrooms, like relaxed rooms. There's of course not too much living space, let's say, in the Apple or Facebook campuses, but nevertheless, it feels similar, and we could see some convergence back to that model. But here's the key I want to bring home here. When something is not growing organically from the entrepreneur's point of view, when it's top down, it's probably not a good idea, and that's what remote work is. And that's why we think that what Musk is doing is very important, not just for Twitter, but for the whole economy. We hope that it will proliferate across corporate America and then the world, that going back to the office is the right thing to do, and it will help the Fed stop pumping interest rates up and slowing down the economy. So last thing I want to say here is, again, let's say get back to Marc Andreessen a little bit. Again, I've noticed that sort of a venture capital model that is, symbolized by Marc Andreessen Horowitz as probably the number one firm right now in Silicon Valley. I think it's in trouble. It's in trouble because I feel that we're kind of losing the touch with economics. What do I mean with that? Venture capital was never really good with economics, but it was more like sort of the macro stuff, the interest rates, debt. When I talk even today with leading venture capitalists, they don't understand what that means, deflation, all that kind of stuff, which is fine. They're usually technologists, company builders. They don't worry too much about macroeconomics. But one thing that I think everybody who's in any kind of business needs to understand is first principles economics, which, let's say, I call it Austrian economics, or for those people who don't know what that means, it's simply, okay, what are sort of the primitives of economics? And the primitives of economics are, one of them at least, is human behavior. And within human behavior, we have primitives. Humans tend to be complacent. They tend to be status-driven, and they let's say they have a confused relationship with the truth. That's just how humans are. No judgment, no ethical or moral judgment at all here. It's just how humans are. It's hard it's hard to admit mistakes. We're status-driven, and we're complacent. We are complacent, everybody. It's very difficult to uncomplace yourself. What I mean with that is simply, if something's comfortable, we keep doing it, and that leads to complacency. So we're not wired to not do that. Maybe in the past we were, but since the Stone Age, we somehow have lost that. That is a primitive of human behavior. And one way to fix that is through physical presence, when people are together. There's sort of a reciprocity going on here. I'm complacent, you're complacent, we kind of cross-check each other. And if we're remote, we just end up in this complacency, and it becomes very transactional and not very productive. Again, it doesn't work, it doesn't apply to everything. There are use cases where remote work works. Programming, writing. The point though is they're organically evolved, and that's the key. So I'm not against remote work, but what I'm against is when authority imposes on us, and then we take it and say, well, this is a trend, this is the future. That I don't agree with. To summarize, this is a comment on a reaction to Marc Andreessen and his comments on why remote work is the future. It is also a reaction to Elon Musk and his telling people to go back to the office at Twitter. I think it's a good thing because it is galvanizing the problem or galvanizing people around the problem of lack of productivity, which is driving inflation, which is one of the key problems of today. The Fed is forced to raise rates because people don't want to work. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying Marc Andreessen is wrong with his statement that remote work is the future. It could be. However, it's not going to be the future because it was imposed on us by the authorities, and then we somehow discovered it. That's not what's going on. The only way remote work can work is if it grows organically. And I do agree with Mark that maybe the old types of companies, and Twitter is part of that, anything which has been built maybe in the last 20, 30 years is going to have have a hard time to change into some sort of remote setting. It is possible that a new type of company can be evolved and founded along problems that lend themselves to be solved in a decentralized way. That's not absolutely impossible. But what I'm absolutely against is this idea that current companies, normal companies, now switch to the remote work problem. That is not good, and that needs to stop, because that is the main driver of inflation. Because if you work remote, you have the problem of complacency, confused relationship with the truth, and status driven, which means you don't do things like admit mistakes and that kind of stuff. You forge friendships with important people instead of the people that really are the most productive people, and so on and so forth. It's just not efficient, and it creates less productivity, and therefore drives up inflation. This is my argument here, and I think what Elon Musk is doing is the right thing, telling not just the people at Twitter, but in general, telling everybody, listen, you got to go back to the office. What that means is you got to go back to work. You got to start solving problems in the Popperian way. This is definitely how Musk sees the world. Not most other companies don't. And I think the last thing I want to say here is the following. I think that companies that are exposed to real competition, that are in a real marketplace, cannot afford to do remote work. The companies that are touting remote work is the ones that somehow don't have a lot of competition, which is a problem in itself. So again, hopefully people go back to work. The Fed can stop raising rates, maybe even lower rates, so we can get back to prosperity and growth. Thank you.